This morning's session boasts an excellent array of philosophers for you all. The topic is trauma and healing in personal and political relationships. And we're going to have a slightly different structure to the talk because we have 4 panelists instead of 3, so we're just going to compress things a little bit. So each speaker will go for about 25 minutes and give like a very concise, focused argument, and then we'll have 10 minutes of questions for each speaker as we go. So we're not going to have a question period at the end. We're just going to do questions for about 10 minutes for each speaker, and we'll take our break in the middle after 2 speakers. And that will be a break of approximately 10 to 15 minutes, depending on our time. And then we'll come back, do 2 more speakers, and that'll conclude roughly at around 11:30 for lunch, okay? So our first speaker is Professor Monica Betzler, who is the Chair for Practical Philosophy and Ethics at LMU Munich. And her paper is After Separation, the Ethics of Divorce. Let's welcome Professor Betzler.
It feels really good, so thank you so much. It's great to be here. I'm really happy, and I've learned already much over these past days about different perspectives on trauma and healing. So I'm not really going to talk about trauma, but our focus today is on personal and political relationships. In my case, personal relationships which often are the locus of trauma. And in the terminology of a moral philosopher, it's the locus of distinct kinds of relational wrongs that I like to investigate in this talk. So it's interesting because especially leading personal relationships, including ending them, gives rise, typically, to distinct kinds of relational wrongs that moral philosophers so far have vastly neglected. And I think personally that it's high time to look into this and discuss what's at issue and what duties partners, including former partners, might have. So it's kind of an obvious truth that many romantic partners separate, amply empirically corroborated, and there's lots of anecdotal evidence too. So when we end a partnership, one might say, we cancel the duties of partiality associated with our former partnership, duties that we acknowledged when we were in a romantic partnership, such as a duty to assist, take particular concern, and care for our partner. And it is the acknowledgement of those duties of partiality that typically give shape and content to our lives. So when we end a particular romantic partnership, we usually find ourselves in what one could call a normative vacuum. We face uncertainty not only how to move forward in our own lives, we also face uncertainty about how we should morally relate to our former partner after a separation. Are we now permitted to treat each other like strangers? Do we go back in moral space because we're not related anymore? Or worse, should we treat each other like enemies? Or do we face distinct kinds of post-separation duties? So this is what I'm going to talk about, even though this is a brief talk. My strategy is to try to elucidate the distinct wrongs that might occur after separation and consider how these wrongs might be addressed by a variety of duties that former partners should acknowledge, and argue tentatively, at least, for the claim that the fact that former partners were once in a committed relationship leaves some kind of normative remainder, interestingly, because former partners continue to have special and directed duties with regard to each other, including to themselves, after their partnership has ended. So this might sound pretty counterintuitive, but this is what I try to argue for. And the aim is to provide at least some ethical guidance after separation. So before I get started, let me prepare the ground. The worry is, or some might worry when I talk about post-divorce or post-separation duties, how could one even talk about this? Because relationships are highly context sensitive, they're very different histories, people have very different personalities, and there's a high degree of epistemic and ethical opacity involved, not only leading relationships, but also in ending them. It's difficult to know and agree on what duties partners have, especially formal partners. So that's the opacity involved in separation. So one might worry that there is no universal theory of post-separation duties to be had, given the context dependence and all that opacity clouding our analysis of formal relationships. So I fully agree that this context dependence and opacity might not be fully resolvable in practice, but I don't think that need concern us here that much, because my aim is to look on a more abstract level what these post-separation duties generally could be and what they are grounded in. And once we've laid that out, we will then be able to better assess how such duties might be weakened or altered or canceled altogether, given the particular context dependence of a particular relationship. Also, right from the start, I will disregard, for these reasons, abusive relationships, but I will come back to those at the end of my talk. I also rule out cases where former partners are psychologically compromised and therefore unable to fulfill any duties. And I will rule out cases in which partners have duties in virtue of having children together. These are additional duties grounded in children's rights or in children's well-being. So surely partners who have children together have duties, but I think that's much more intuitive than the duties they might have towards each other, including to themselves after separation. And these are the ones I'm going to look into. One might also worry, why do I talk about duties? Isn't that overly moralistic? I don't want to claim that this is the only moral currency at issue when it comes to ending personal relationships. Virtues might be very helpful, and there might be other moral currencies relevant, but note that when I use the term duty, all I mean to say are morally weighty constraints in our deliberation, and the duties, when I talk about them, are pro tanto and can be outweighed by other weighty moral considerations. So they might not be as strong as the term seems to suggest. And when I talk about separation, I do mean to include divorce, but my analysis is not limited to marriage and its ending. I do mean the intentional breakup of a committed romantic partnership characterized by a shared history of relevant attitudes and interactions over time. So to get at the distinct wrongs that might be involved after a particular romantic partnership has ended, we moral philosophers like to analyze hypothetical scenarios. So let me present 4 cases with the intention to tease out our intuitions about these cases. So here's scenario 1. Aisha and Baha. Aisha has left Baha because Aisha felt they had grown apart. It has been difficult for Baha to come to grips with Aisha's decision. After their separation, Baha leaks details about Aisha's behavior that only he, as her former partner, could know. For example, he tells a mutual friend that Aisha is a bad lover. I'll leave it up to you to think about it right now, but I'll come to it later. Scenario 2. Gregory is unable to cope with his divorce from Heather. He continues to blame her for leaving him. He writes messages to her, insisting that she gets back together with him. He obsesses over their former relationship, cataloging souvenirs and love letters, talking about Heather endlessly to friends, and continues to live in hope of a reunion. Scenario 3. Kibusa has moved out of her shared home with Deidara. Deidara learns from a mutual friend that Kibusa has destroyed all signs of shared memories with her. She has, in fact, moved on quickly to start a new romantic partnership. Scenario 4, Ida learns that the mother of John, her former partner, has died. Ida knows that John's mother was very important to him. In fact, Ida had a good relationship with John's mother during and after her relationship with John. However, Ida does not send her condolences, nor does she mention John's mother's death when she encounters him. So to be sure, these are stylized examples and we might have different views on them. But I think, and I'm curious what you think in the Q&A, that they might point us to distinct kinds of duties at issue after separation. So let me highlight the first duty, which I call the duty to not betray trust and keep entrusted information confidential. So in scenario 1, in intentionally and publicly revealing information about Aisha that matters deeply to her, namely what kind of lover she is, Baha disregards Aisha's fundamental interest in keeping that information about her private. And it seems like one might say, well, he's just violating her right to privacy, and that has nothing to do with their relationship. I might overhear somebody's conversation where somebody, talks about something very private, and if I leak that to others, I violate these persons' right to privacy without ever having had a relationship with them. So why is this a special duty? Well, there seems to be something distinctive about how Baha violates Aisha's right to privacy. Because what's distinctive is that he acquired that information in co-creating an important relationship good, namely sexual intimacy. And it takes trust, mutual trust, to create that good. And Baha invited Aisha's trust, as did she. So publicizing intimate information not only violates Aisha's right to privacy, but also betrays her trust in Baha respecting her right to privacy. And in doing so, it seems that Baha disempowers Aisha's ability to form trusting relationships in the future, and he undermines, potentially, his own sense of being a trustworthy partner. And the interesting bit is, because this wrong can occur even after the relationship has ended, the duty to not betray trust and keep entrusted information confidential continues to be special and survives, in some sense at least, the end of this particular relationship. So Annette Bayer once said, trust takes on a curious life of its own. Now let me look at the second scenario. By dismissing Heather's decision to leave and holding on to the relationship, even after separation, Gregory seems incapable of accepting Heather's reasons to separate. And I think he fails to live up to a duty that I call the duty to let go. Because he disrespects Heather's right to relational freedom, and it seems that any blame for Heather's decision to separate is overall unwarranted after separation. They might have reasons to blame each other in the process of separation. Blame might be fitting in that process, and they might have reasons to negotiate. But once they decided to separate, it seems blame is overall unwarranted. So Gregory seems to wrong Heather in her credibility as a rational agent who has the right to assess reasons by her own lights and whose testimony about her reasons is relevant for the case at hand. So letting go, I think, is something like a unilateral and disengaging attitude that is fitting post-divorce or post-separation. It involves the cessation of the disposition to blame and negotiate, and it involves the acknowledgement that the former partner had justifiable reasons to separate, at least by that partner's own lights, and even if I don't come to agree on those reasons. And we wrong our former partner in entirely disregarding their reasons for separation, but we also wrong ourselves. And I'm not going to argue for duties towards ourselves. I'm simply assuming that there are such duties and that the case can be made for duties to ourselves. It seems that we also wrong ourselves if we do not resume our autonomous agency and move on. For example, by taking responsibility for our own involvement in the separation having come about. Now, in the third case, Kibusa does not respond appropriately to the fact that her once valued relationship with Deidara has ended. So it's kind of the reverse case. So in the second case, it seems like Gregory hangs on to the relationship and fails to live up to the duty to let go. In this case, it's much rather the case that the person moves on too quickly to another relationship. And one could say that the fact that a once valued relationship has ended does not only involve this duty to let go and move on, it also involves another fitting attitude, namely the duty to grieve. So grief can be directed toward people who no longer exist, and there is a vast literature on grief and what makes it fitting, and most philosophers think about grief as an attitude that's directed towards people who have passed away, but I think it's an equally fitting attitude towards people who have socially passed away, if you like. So it can be directed toward people who either physically or socially no longer are there for us, and who played a significant role in how we came to see ourselves. So when grieving and undergoing the complexes of emotion that grief comprises, we seem to look at the relevant past relationship by responding to its loss and the significance it has for us. And it is through grief, through engaging in this vast array of emotions that grief comprises, that we determine how the former relationship, what its value was for us, and how it fits into our future life course. So in quickly or too quickly moving on to a new relationship, Kibusa wrongs herself as she deprives herself from gaining a deeper understanding of what her relationship with Deidara meant to her, and without grief, she deprives herself of an existential source of self-understanding, again necessary to resume her autonomous agency. Now finally, in scenario 4, Ida does not recall to the death of John's mother and doesn't offer condolences. And I think there might be some justification for blaming Ida that she fails to offer those condolences. And there's interesting work by Cheshire Kaloun that I resort to. She tried to delineate what she calls a duty to be decent. And I think Ida fails to live up to that duty to be decent. What is a duty to be decent? The duty to be decent differs, according to Kaloun, from supererogatory acts in that it can be expected of an agent to be decent, but it also differs from other moral duties that it seems to be elective. And that's because social conventions mark what one should do if one is, quote, a minimally well-formed moral agent. So it's morally objectionable, in some sense at least, for Ida to not offer condolences to John because the costs are low, and failing to acknowledge his mother's death ignores something especially important to him. And that's what this minimal moral duty to be decent amounts to. It's a minimal moral duty if it is, according to Kaloun, motivationally non-taxing, obvious, and non-ambiguous. So if it's emotionally not too taxing for Ida to offer those condolences, and if it's not ambiguous to her former partner, for example, because it invites him back into her life or something, then it would be ambiguous. If that's not the case, it is a minimal moral duty to be decent she should fulfill. In contrast, if it's more taxing and more ambiguous, it would be something like minimal moral gift giving, and I do not think that Ida is required to give a moral gift. So it depends on how low the costs are and how non-ambiguous this duty is. But the duty to be decent, all other things equal, continues to be a special duty after separation. So I hope to have sort of shown in this very short talk that romantic partnerships leave a normative remainder even after the former partners have ended their relationship. The relevant duties are self-regarding or other-regarding or both. They are neither exclusive, so the duty to let go might partly overlap with the duty to grieve, nor are they fully exhaustive. There might be other kinds of duties after separation I couldn't think of. I still think these are the most plausible ones. And arguably, fulfilling these duties is a way of coming to non-wronging terms with the fact that the relationship with a former romantic partner is now over. Some of these duties are positive, like the duty to let go and the duty to grieve. And they are what Odette Naaman calls self-consuming duties. That is, we surely don't have a duty to grieve 30 years after the divorce has happened. So eventually, these duties kind of go away, but these are duties that typically arise post-separation. And some of these duties are negative, like the duty to not betray entrusted information, or the duty to not be indecent. Depending on the circumstances, these duties might never arise in practice. You know, some former partner's mother might just not die, and I don't have an occasion to offer my condolences. And they can also weaken over time, and they surely might be canceled in cases of abusive relationships. So even in bad relationships, I might have a duty to let go and a duty to grieve, but I might not have a duty to be decent, and I might not have a duty to keep entrusted information confidential. So this is where the context dependence of a relationship comes in and has an impact on the kinds of duties we actually face. So it seems that we often struggle after separation how to relate to a former partner. I hope to have at least alluded to that the fact that separation does leave a normative remainder and leaving us with distinct kinds of special post-divorce or post-separation duties. The duties continue to be special because they are grounded in the former relationship, so they're not grounded in the fact that another person has equal moral worth. These are not duties we owe to everyone. These are only duties we owe to our former partner in virtue of having been our former partner, or that we owe to ourselves in virtue of having been a former partner. And there are other regarding and self-regarding. And they're directed in the sense that they're directed to the other former partner as a particular, or including ourselves as a particular former partner. And elucidating these duties addresses the specific relational wrongs occurring after separation and hopefully helps former partners to better come to grips with separation. Thanks very much.
Thank you for that excellent paper. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes now for questions. So just raise your hand and I'll point. Okay, so we're going to go right at the back's the first hand I saw. in the green jacket, and then in front here, Professor Moss. And then if there's time, I'm going to go here, and then we'll come across the room. But given that there's only 10 minutes, I'm going to start with 3 and see how we do.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My name is Kelly Cunningham, and my question is just about to what extent you think these duties are specific to romantic relationships, because it seems like all 4 of them, especially the first one of like duty to not betray trust or keep confidential information private, would also apply to friendships as well as romantic partnerships. So I'm just wondering, like, is this distinct to romantic relationships? And if so, what makes them distinct?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think you're right. There is a shaded area between romantic partnerships and very close friendships. And I agree that some of these duties apply to very close friendships as well. I think romantic partnerships just stand out, usually, as distinct kinds of not only committed relationships as our friendships, but as relationships where we take our partner or regard our partner, even our former partner, as somebody who's exclusive. And we usually don't do that in friendships. But it's not the first time that I hear this comment. So, you know, I think if there are people who have like super close friendships, but the friend has this kind of exclusivity typical for romantic partnerships, I think that carries over and the same duties apply. So thanks.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes, I'm Jessica Moss. That was exactly my question, so I'll just use this as a follow-up. And just to say, yeah, my thought was, well, maybe a romantic relationship just offers more opportunities for the kinds of forming of trust, and therefore for the kind of betrayal of trust, and for the kind of exclusivity in there. But it did seem to me like of the duties that you mentioned, none of them seemed exclusively romantic, and that maybe it would be more a matter of degree. Yeah, and I thought that was very interesting to think about the duties. I mean, maybe we break up with friends less often than we break up with partners and things, but it did seem to me like a matter of degree and kind of determining a determinable rather than different kind.
Right, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think I agree that it is a matter of degree. I think I still have a tendency to hold on to the view that romantic partnerships, more often than not, are a particular locus of betrayal, because we usually, and I mean there are always exceptions, consider them as being exclusive or consider our partners being exclusive. And there's more intimacy, etc. But you know, there are exceptions, and maybe people lead friendships that are similar, so that I'm fine with that. So I just took romantic partnership, or what I call romantic partnerships, or particular kinds of intimate relationships, as paradigm examples for the locus of distinct kinds of relational wrongs that happen even if we've broken up. And as you just suggested yourself, it happens much more rarely, at least to my knowledge, that we break up with friends than we do with our partners. And I think that's exactly tied to this kind of exclusivity that we expect from former partners. But again, I'm happy with this, that we come to agree on our degrees, and that there is some overlap between romantic partnerships and close friendships.
Yes. Thanks for the wonderful talk. I have a question, maybe a clarification question regarding the duty you just mentioned. Most of the duty like you mentioned, such as the duty to be decent, the duty to let go, and the duty of grief, seems like an imperfect duty to me that leave latitudes for us to do like how would I want the duty to be. I wonder, is there any positive or like perfect duty that implicates in your account that tells us like the ethics of divorce or separation? Thank you.
Thank you. I think I mentioned the distinction between positive and negative duties, and that might align with your distinction between perfect and imperfect duties, so that the positive duties are imperfect duties that allow for some latitude how we fulfill them, whereas the negative duties do not allow for that kind of latitude. So I just, must not betray trust, period, and there is no latitude involved. So the negative duties I try to highlight, especially the one tied to trust and betrayal, I think is a perfect duty. And the only thing is that these duties might be canceled depending on the distinct context of the relationship. And that's what I try to highlight at the end. If it's an abusive relationship, which is sort of an extreme case, we might not have those negative duties. Thank you.
Monica, I think you discovered an important cultural lacuna. Because you see, if you look at world civilizations, courtship has been ritualized. Weddings have been ritualized. How to treat your in-laws, the good ones and the not so good ones. I mean, there seems to be an advice for everything, right? But I don't remember growing up anyone telling me in my family or among my friends, well, listen, when it comes to separation, this is what you should do or not do, right? And I think it's because there is a cultural assumption across civilizations that couples stay together for life. Mm-hmm. And what we are facing is that is becoming actually rather rare. And I think that's where your work can play a really very important role. So no question, just a comment.
So thank you so much, Tamara. I think that's true. I haven't thought about it that way. But it is true that sort of all these meaningful existentially important experiences are ritualized in our societies, in any society. But we've gone liberal and we have forgotten that if we're liberal and we allow for separation, and I'm not against separation, that we might need sort of rituals as well, even though I didn't look at the ritual aspect of it, but I wanted to dig a bit deeper and sort of carve out the duties that might be involved. But as I said, my hope is to provide some sort of ethical guidance about how we should deal with each other. I also have a paper about divorce as such, so what we owe to each other in the process of separating. And this is a paper about what we owe to each other, including to ourselves, post the fact, after separation. So, because I also agree, I think there's a huge gap in moral theorizing about, in dealing with these kinds of questions that, are of great importance to many of us. If you look at the divorce rates, I think it applies to many people, and so we better think about it. Yeah, thanks very much.
And I have one question myself. Thank you for your talk. There seems to be a worrying consequence between your first and third duties that you label here. The first being not to betray trust, the second to be the duty to grieve, okay? Usually when a relationship ends, the first people you go to are like other cared ones, that you go to for, help. Okay, you talk about how the relationship might have ended or what went wrong, so you fully disclose a lot of intimate details about the relationship and how it ended in the process of grieving with another person. So it seems that the way you formulate it here, you're going to always have to grieve on your own and never really fully disclose to any other.
Okay, that's a super interesting point. I guess I have to think about this more, so thanks very much. I'm not sure what to answer off the top of my head, because it sounds kind of negative that you are doomed to grieve for yourself. But maybe to some extent you are. Right? If you don't want to betray other people's, not in everything and in every matter that pertains to your former relationship. And maybe there can be trusting sort of friendships where you can disclose some things. But it gets very easily very iffy and very problematic. And I think people have different views about how much you should convey to a close friend, for example, about your former partnership. I think that's up for debate. Maybe some people would think you need that to process your grief. maybe others would say you should see a therapist, and that's more confidential. But at least you should be aware that you might violate certain duties you have to not betray your former partner in very important respects.
All right, that's all the time we have for our first paper. Thanks, Professor Betzler. Okay, we're going to go right into our second paper, which is going to be from Professor Raymond Orr, who's an associate professor in the political science department at the University of Miami, and who will be talking to us today a paper about trauma as convenient wronging or meaningful theory.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation and also for making this conference possible. It was a significant effort from faculty, staff, students, community members, and it's been really excellent, so thank you. My talk today looks at what we may mean when we invoke the term trauma. Its usage is of interest because it seems rather evident that trauma's use has increased over the recent decades. So let me provide an example of what I mean here. So if we look at Google's Ngram, it shows that trauma as a percentage of all words published in English has doubled since the year 2000. Clearly something is happening. And such an increase in use typically does not kind of bring conceptual clarity. And this seems to be the case for trauma. I suggest that the term is used in multiple ways, but that I want to look at actually two ways in which it's used, starting with this very simple statement. That traumatized me. The first potential claim here is that we're talking about a psychological state being described. I call this trauma as psychological distress. It's individual, it's internally found, and it's witnessed as the presence of self-undermining behavior born from experience. If you say or agree with someone who's using this statement, you are affirming a particular type of irrationality that's associated with it, and something I want to claim that we don't really, or we're not really inclined to do. And a second potential association is a wronging has taken place, potentially something that was done that transgresses expectations, safety, desire, dignity. This is what I'm going to call trauma as connoting an injustice. And here I mean kind of an association, not a conceptual implication. And instead of being a psychological or analytic explanation, the use of trauma identifies a past wrong that is felt to be ongoing. This allows us to kind of identify an act of injustice and perhaps call on it to be rectified. Now, I'm partial to trauma as a psychological form of distress, and I think it's more meaningful to put my kind of cards on the table here. Yet both forms of trauma were present at the origin of the 19th century Western conception of trauma as, let's say, for instance, railroad spine and compensation that Joseph Tankey's presentation discussed on Sunday. Now, trauma as connoting an injustice is something different than trauma as a psychological distress. Yet, in addition to kind of drawing conceptual boundaries between these two approaches, I'm interested in considering why this term has become commonplace and common acceptance. Trauma as connoting injustice might be tempting and appealing to us and our sensitivities, rather than commenting on one's undesirable psychological state. Part of the talk today is therefore interested in the sanitization via moralization of trauma and to be more palatable under today's sensitivities. I suggest this because trauma as a psychological state involves a paradigm that makes claims to the human psyche that is tormented, that's unflattering, that's even monstrous, and kind of identifiable by its ability to ruin. Now, we're in polite company here, but when we think about trauma, when we talk about trauma, we're talking about the phenomenon in which mothers drown their children and war victims and war perpetrators or combat veterans scream in the night. So it's something that's very, very intense. That's a form of perhaps insanity. And by gravitating trauma to kind of connoting an injustice, we avoid what I'm going to call a slanderous sympathy, whereby using the term involves pathologizing those who suffer. So let me give you a little bit of an outline of the next 20 minutes. First, I'm going to give kind of time considerations. I'm going to kind of give a rather kind of terse count of other concerns that have arisen in trauma research that kind of think about the concepts, conceptual boundaries as becoming more permissive. And this part of the talk, this is kind of a result of the expansion of trauma from an individual to a social phenomenon. This tension has been explored in a few of the panels already in some of the questions, and I hope to kind of add to that. Second, I'll describe features of trauma as psychological distress, offering, in essence, 4 components to that. Third, I'll do the same thing with trauma as connoting an injustice. And fourth, I want to do something perhaps a little bit unexpected and include an indigenous example to kind of illuminate trauma as psychological distress and also its relationship to bringing forth something that we might call as justice. And I use the Haudenosaunee people, otherwise known as the Iroquois, and how their key leadership ceremonies were about trauma in order to uphold or make possible justice or appropriate action. Now, fourth here, I want to kind of explore trauma, or fifth, explore trauma as connoting an injustice and why that has become particularly appealing. So a few caveats about why I'm kind of talking about this before I get into how I'm going to frame it. So first, a brief note on why I'm talking about this in my background. So I teach Native American studies and I'm a political scientist. And a few years ago, I wrote a book on the role of trauma in Native American tribal politics. But specifically, it was about the interplay of trauma and economic development. And part of this work considers the ways in which trauma increased difficulties around politics and also kind of at the communal or tribal level. Tribal members engaged the political arena looking for healing, and that's maybe something that politics can't really achieve. And I don't want to go into this too much because reservation politics can be yours for the reasonable price of $29.95. But I wish to kind of acknowledge that this interest in trauma comes from here and grappling what it might mean or what it might do. So I'll speak frankly also about trauma. Those who suffer it deserve kind of description that is forthright. It offers an explanation for the most heinous acts in humanity, their causes and their effects. And a final caveat here is that trauma as wrongdoing and distress and also as a moral injustice are not mutually exclusive. Something might be traumatizing and from a wrongdoing, but it also might be as a result of natural disasters, medical events, accidents, misfortunes. And so I'm most interested in this, though, human-caused forms and events that create trauma because they're more amenable to kind of inserting notions of wrongdoing. So let me provide a bit of a background on how others have kind of identified this conceptual expansion and acceptance of trauma. So over 10 years ago, French psychologist and anthropologist published Empire of Trauma, an inquiry into the conditions of victimhood. Fassen and Reichman claimed that something has changed rather kind of radically. Among the many claims of this work, one is that compared to 30 years ago, we see trauma as expansive, some kind of empire, if you will. That's the term that they use. And it went from an individual phenomenon to a collective, and now entire towns may receive professionals after a catastrophe. This was not the case 50 years ago. Psychologists were not necessarily sent out to natural disasters, and it goes without question that they may be now. Another identifiable change is that trauma has been generally accepted as existing, and existing where it is claimed. That is, we have difficulty denying another's trauma. When we deny it, it's kind of this professed trauma. We are kind of in gross violation of an accepted norm. So I'm interested in extending upon this aspect here. A second interest is this kind of assumption that if the world were to be brought into a more morally correct state, it would help alleviate trauma. Speaking in the language of social justice, there might be evidence that this is not true. Work by Richard Malachy, who's a director of the Harvard program on refugee trauma and professor of psychology, makes claims that when looking at experiences of Bosnian victims of war crimes, international tribunals and their verdicts did little to bring healing. His healing invisible wounds is not, of course, pessimistic about healing, but it's that greater social justice is not sufficient as a condition for healing. So given some kind of the scaffolding here, let me talk and turn about kind of thinking about trauma in terms of a psychological feature before considering it as an injustice. So here I outline the significant features of conceptualizing trauma as psychological distress. Trauma is a current but also exists retrospectively. Trauma is a current psychological state, but also has its origins understood accurately as in a prior event. There's no such thing as a traumatic act in this perspective, rather that there is an act that causes trauma. Now let me provide an example of one, and I'm going to make it a bit unusually light here because it's still early in the morning and one that we can all kind of relate to. And I'll go through and use this example for the rest of this section. Our protagonist is Stephen, and he's catching an early morning flight. He schedules a ride to the airport using a ride-sharing app. Nobody shows up, and Stephen misses his flight. This is an unfortunate event, but is not yet trauma. Instead, the trauma is Stephen lying in bed, unable to sleep, the next time he's relying upon this app to get to the airport. It's not the original event, but the experience of that event later on that's trauma. Second, trauma is inward focusing and individual focusing. It's not about the external world. It exists at the experiential level, not necessarily the conceptual level. It's not a reflection on our society. Trauma in this approach makes few particular claims to others, not many. Stephen's problem is now with himself. To focus on others is often to fixate on the external traumatic act. It therefore magnifies the trauma. Third, trauma alters perception. Using the example of Stephen, it's not that he was done unjustly. It is that he is unable to sleep, and he wants to sleep. He cannot trust as he did prior. This is different than saying that he's owed something, and that if Lyft made greater promises or paid him back for flight changes, then the trauma would be resolved. Merging this with what the point one here, the feature of trauma in a certain sense is the inability to allow something new or the difficulty to allow something new to emerge. A fourth feature here is that trauma is typically understood as moving individuals away from a desired or orthodox behaviors to what we more comfortably used to call irrationality. Stephen, in this case, finds sleep desirable, and he can't sleep, despite the likelihood that things will be fine. There's a desired state that, if interrupted by invasive thoughts of what will happen tomorrow when he's transportation insecure. So let me think about it in terms of trauma as connoting an injustice here and conceptualizing some of these different features. The first here is that trauma in this perspective is also retrospective. So there's no difference here. I don't need there to be, but I think that this also exists in the past. Second is that trauma as an injustice may be more likely to be collective. In this view, trauma is both individual, but makes claims about the nature of the external world and its operations. This is ironic in a certain sense because the feature of trauma is to fixate on the perpetrator of trauma rather than oneself. A third, trauma in terms of connoting an injustice, a third feature is it need not alter perspectives, right, or perception. It may be, in fact, offer a certain insight or a certain clarity into the world about what is right or wrong. So injustice might kind of conclude that there is a problem with you, not a problem with me. So fourth, there may be no claim in essence that individuals exhibit injury that creates this idea of altered behavior in reality or their connection to reality. So it's an external focusing in this approach, and the trauma says nothing about how I need to adjust my relationship to the world. So these are just a few of the ways in which we might think about some of the differences between these two different approaches to trauma. Now, trauma as a psychological distress was not solely that of the European or Western intellectual domain. This conference has been especially kind of rich in exploring trauma via cross-cultural contact. And indeed, my own field, there's much outstanding work on Native American indigenous notions of trauma and loss. Professor Tanke had mentioned Yellow Horse Braveheart and this concept of the soul wound, and I'm glad that he did. But here I'm going to look at and focus on trauma and this dilemma between these two different approaches that I've laid out between distress and injustice. And I'm going to use the example of the Iroquois Confederacy, otherwise known as the Haudenosaunee people, which is what we describe of as being like the people versus the political unit being the Iroquois Confederacy, and focus on their origin story of their governance. Now, a quick warning, I'm not going to be able to provide a great deal of detail or a comprehensive account of their group, their politics, their ceremony. My goal here is to kind of show an example of how a group puts healing before justice and what we might be able to kind of gain from thinking about that. Now, a brief background on the Iroquois. They're established in the 15th century, this confederacy group in the 15th century, and they're a political affiliation of multiple groups, what we might think of as nations or tribes. And the Haudenosaunee, again, being the term of like the linguistic and cultural group here. They're the same people. Now, the Iroquois have their homelands in the Northeast, and they're one of the very few nations that have remained there politically intact over the centuries of colonization. Each of these, there are five now, there are six now, there were originally five, manage their own affairs. So the Mohawk handles its own affairs historically here, but they collaborate in terms of international relations and defense. They operate a centralized decision-making body. And their political organization was once something that actually allowed them to remain and be quite savvy about playing off different European powers. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the founding document of the Iroquois Confederacy, something called the Great Law of Peace, which, if you want to take a look at what Benjamin Franklin had said, that it is, in essence, an inspiration for the U.S. Constitution. So some people have made that kind of claim how they're able to do it. Now, before this system was codified and created the Iroquois Confederacy, warfare and revenge were common. Bloodshed in this pre-15th century period was actually known as the Morning Wars. Right? And I don't like the term myth in this context, but this foundational story of the Great Law of Peace is set in the midst of a lot of vengeful acts. And so I'll take you through kind of the very, very highlights of it. And so there are three major players in this story. That the first one is Hiawatha, who's a mourner and the protagonist, whose wife and daughters were killed. And this is a loss that he is continually mourning. And then there's the great peacemaker, who's sent from the Creator with knowledge of ceremonies to help people heal. And then there's the evil sorcerer, but you could probably figure that out with the person with the snakes here, who needs to be convinced that he should stop using his dark magic. So this story starts with Hiawatha, who's mourning the death of his family. One version is they are killed by this sorcerer, but Hiawatha wanders the forest as a wild man, as a cannibal. And the name Hiawatha itself means he who has lost his mind and finds it. Hiawatha is visited by the peacemaker who teaches Hiawatha. The peacemaker has this kind of particular ceremony that he's given, and he gives Hiawatha called the ceremony of condolence. And it's to ease his loss and gain a certain kind of clarity. This ceremony first removes his tears so that Hiawatha may see. Then it opens his ears so that Hiawatha may be able to hear, and then clears the throat so that he may speak. And they travel and move this kind of condolence ceremony around, and people agree with it, and then end up with the evil sorcerer and convince him to desist his kind of sorcery. And parts of the Iroquois Confederacy come from these three different figures, but the claim that I want to make here is that healing comes before leadership, comes before kind of this type of collective action around what might be a just or better world. And we see this story and trauma as being institutionalized from this period in two different ways. The first is this idea of leadership initiation, whereby it's not an oath of office, but rather it asks people who are to be leaders to address their loss the way that Hiawatha did. A second in this condolence ceremony is that it's codified by physical items, wampum belts that are brought by the great peacemaker. You might be familiar with these wampum belts. They're not about economic exchange, but about memory and relationships. And these are actually kind of created to remind people of this ceremony. And that we look at what's made out of this particular, or what these wampum belts are made out of, it is a quahog shell. And the white part of this is something that represents order, clarity, and healing. And then the purple is something that's disorder, chaos, and loss. So we can see this being kind of ritualized and institutionalized this way. And I say a little bit more about this in the paper form, but the claim here is that for leaders to operate perhaps justly, it requires a clear mind and addressing their loss. So when we think about in terms of switching to trauma, and why is that it's so appealing to think about it as an injustice? So why do we do it? Certainly terms from psychology have made their way to common speech. Professional argot doesn't stay there. Similar psychological concepts with similar kind of induction may include but not be limited to closure, transference, projection. We all use those. And so why is it that there's this appeal, in essence, of the language of psychology to the non-psychological fields? And it's certainly appealing to think about trauma as a form of injustice. It allows us for a course correction that heals and rights the world. It feels good to point out injustice and wrongdoing. It feels powerful, inclusionary. I think the actual term is it feels righteous, right? But by emphasizing justice, we might incorrectly make it synonymous with healing, as though the world has a greater forms of justice is a world that is healed. And that might be a bit naive, though perhaps a world that is healed is a world that is capable of more justice. Put the trauma as a psychological distress first, not justice as a feature, as the great law of peace did. And for scholarship, there's a pronounced movement as well to emphasize those who have been overlooked, the dismissed, the mistreated. We might use the term marginalized. My field, Native American Studies, was created to give voice to indigenous peoples and take into account their perspectives that have been placed further away. So also by using trauma in its psychological distress form, we might be sympathetic, though engage in a form of slanderous sympathy. One in which those who are tormented by the past and its horrors, and in a certain sense are engaged in it currently, are unable to hear clearly, see, or have these types of emotions that we may think of as constituting something close to rationality. So in this account, though, this kind of greater use of trauma in this term might be a little bit more instrumental and more charitable. It might be that our end point is actually not to talk about trauma, but to talk about something like injustice. The trauma is, as I put here, this kind of cover story that we'll use any means necessary to talk about what we really want to talk about, including the suffering of those who are marginalized, to be able to talk about the good or what might be virtue or what it might look like. British psychoanalytic philosopher Adam Phillips, writing on dream interpretations, points out that dream work might not really be that important in the sense that dreams may not tell us about our id and what we really want and what's repressed, but it's a pretext for having the conversations that we end up wanting to have. So in terms of limitations, there are plenty. I'm critical of other people's use of language and terms, but help myself to inaccuracy. Right? What do I mean by injustice and justice? I don't exactly know. A fellow limitation is that people misuse language, and maybe that's all that this is. There's nothing new or worthwhile in terms of pursuing. There's a long line of kind of erosion of psychological concepts in public parlance. My sense is, though, that there's something a little bit more here, that we wish to, in a certain sense, make an overture to those who have suffered, but we don't want to make it costly to us in a certain way. So despite such limitations, it's worth considering these two approaches and what we mean when we say something like, that traumatized me. If we bring this concept, psychological claims about distress and even irrationality, do we wish to go so low? What we might be actually saying about human fragility and human nature? Or is it that the use of the term trauma is a cover story to talk about how we would and should order the world, or how one group or one individual wrongs another? So trauma as a psychological distress is a big, deep claim, and it might say something rather ugly that we don't wish to say. Thank you very much for your attention. I really appreciate your comments and questions going forward. Miigwech, and thank you.
Thank you so much for that. So we're amazingly quite on time. So we have another chunk of time now for questions for our speakers. So if you could just raise your hand and I'll try and get in everybody. Okay, so let's start. The first person I saw was Keegan. So 1, 2, and then 3, 4, 5 if we have time. I think we should.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. When you brought up this example of the Iroquois condolence ceremony, there's the imagery of making the individual see again and hear again, and speak again, of course. It reminded me of, I don't know what you think about this, but like woke politics, like people being awakened, right? And I was just wondering if there's some normative component to the seeing and hearing. Like if there's a right way that this now leader has to be directed towards seeing, given that wokeness seems to be progressive. But anyway, what do you think?
But it's a really fascinating and comparison there. I had not thought of it, right? But this idea of reemergence. I don't know enough to know whether or not, Hiawatha was, they talk about how he was before, right? Or is this something new? Is it a return, or is it the possibility of something new? So I think that's really kind of rich conceptually in terms of comparisons there. But I had not thought about transporting this ceremony of what we might kind of conclude from thinking about it, or speculate rather, to such recent phenomena. But a really good question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Vytis. I'm from Vilnius University, Lithuania. I was also wondering about that story of Iroquois. It's clear that the tears have to be removed in order to see. In that story, what does have to be removed in order to hear and in order to speak?
That level of detail I don't know, but it's a really good question in the sense of what is blocking. Now, it may not be something physical, right? It could just be that this level of anguish, right, might not allow people to be in a place to receive information. And I think that probably would correspond pretty well for those of us who've ever tried to console someone who is in anguish, right? That what you say necessarily doesn't matter, that they're in that state, that getting through to someone in a difficult point. I think that's probably what they're thinking about. But I could go back and try to take a look in terms of like what's being pulled out, right? That might actually not be so abstract, but so real. Yeah, no, great question.
Thank you very much. Is it on? Thank you very much for your talk. It brought so much clarity for me in the direction that I think we need to go in Hawaii for the wrongs. When you take it away from the injustice and you focus on the healing first before finding the leadership, and there's so much healing that needs to go on. And when you gave that example of the man in the airplane, and I think instead of saying that traumatized me, it's I am traumatized. So I am traumatized, therefore what do I need to do? So when you described him, I thought, why is his focus on everyone else? Why doesn't, that happened to him, for him, and when it happened for him, he needed to go see himself, and he kept traumatizing himself, in my opinion. He could have gone to what did he need to do next? Get his own ride, do something to make himself be whole and go on. So thank you very much.
Yep. Please.
So I'm Wayne Andrews, and I'm an ethicist. I have two comments. The first is in terms of the model, the example that you use of the person who's traumatized. I think it might be helpful to use something else as a paradigm, because I think many people would think that's a stretch of what constitutes traumatic experience. It was for him. It's not the kind of example that is context. The other thing is, in terms of this, the concern with the group trauma. One of the things that I'm aware of particularly in light of contemporary facts in the Middle East, is that a people who are traumatized, as the Jews have been historically, sometimes can fall subject to a certain problem that we see when it is similar to what happens when a child is brought up in a family where they're physically abused. We know in those cases, that it's difficult to correct it for the next generation. A person who grows up in a family where that happens to him or her is more likely to perpetrate the same crime against their children as was perpetrated against them. Right now, we're seeing something happening in the Middle East that is very much like that. Jewish people were traumatized by a certain experience. They collectively, in an ironic way, have now done certain things. I'm not denying the horror of what's been done to them at all. But nevertheless, the fact that they had that experience, exactly like the child who perpetrates crime against his children, the child who's been abused. You're seeing something like that happen in real time, in real life. My question is, maybe not suitable for everybody to think about, is how can you break that? How can you do that? So I think that when you're talking about trauma, this is one of the things we can do. This is one of the things. It's how we can happen. I don't know at the psychological level of an individual, but we certainly have to figure out how to keep this from happening.
Okay, that's a great set of questions there. So yeah, I think you're talking about the repetition compulsion, right? Whereby someone who is engaged in a behavior that they don't want to be. So the example, I think that it might have been you, but as somebody had brought up a few days ago, is that someone who grows up in an alcoholic family and has a alcoholic parent is more likely to marry an alcoholic, right? Which would be a real indictment on what we want to do with our lives and what we learn from that experience. And there are a few different theories about why that might be the case. Why is it that people engage in this? And I mean, one might be, biological, but another one might be that people are trying to relive this to actually gain victory over this experience. So they recreate the conditions upon which, now that they're an adult, just to use that example, whereby they're now powerful enough to make a different outcome. So that's one view of it. Another one could be, there's some reasons in which we may not think that is the case, because rarely do they win. So why is it they keep on doing it? It could be familiarity, it could be intensity, that it brings up an uncomfortable way of looking at people, though. Absolutely. One issue, though, that's difficult to figure out and is an ongoing problem is that, people are different than societies. People have nervous systems. Societies don't have nervous systems. People can experience things in that way, but society can conceptualize that there may be metaphors, but those are two different systems. And it also could be thinking about, I'm probably going to wade away from the Israeli-Palestine conflict myself, but I'm glad that you brought it up because it's a really important and central theme right now. But what is it that individuals can do themselves to not be seduced by fear as being one, right? And it brings up the question of whether or not certain types of fear are rational or irrational, and whether or not this affects their level of perception that politicians, that ideologies can press these particular types of buttons. We can think about, the election of Donald Trump and his reemergence as being an example of what happened to flyover country and the trauma that has been visited upon them economically, socially, in terms of family orders, in terms of drug use, these aspects. And you can see the people, I'd rather more comfortably talk about that example, but those who stormed the Capitol and was it January 6th were more likely to have experienced bankruptcy, other types of, let's say, economic traumas, and then act out this way. In terms of solutions or healing at the collective level, I think it has to, in a certain sense, I don't know, to be honest. I don't know what people do, but there's restorative justice But I think in part is thinking about it in terms of an individual phenomenon, because going to the comment that you had, that you can't control society in that way, but thinking about that you can and expect something from society is a great way to traumatize yourself or re-traumatize yourself. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much. I'm Larissa Svirsky. I'm at University of Toronto. I was very sympathetic to the thought that it's important to maintain this sense of trauma as psychological distress. And I've also heard a lot of arguments that I find somewhat compelling, this idea that thinking about trauma as psychopathology or other things like depression as well as psychopathology rather than adaptive responses to social ills obscures the need to have important political interventions. But I think one of the injustices that people miss out on when they make those sorts of arguments is the fact that we, as it stands, don't provide adequate support to people who've suffered psychological distress. So how do you find that sort of balancing act where on the one hand, these concepts related to justice are very important to understanding what needs to be done, but also thinking about the individual is just as important as thinking about the political?
That's a fantastic question. I don't have a particular kind of answer for you, but certainly the emphasis that, at least in the United States, is placed on supporting individual therapy, right? And thinking about this as an individual rather than kind of collective, we don't do. And I mean, in the sense of what should we do about, I don't know. I mean, there's all kinds of, we can see it, and I've got a really great colleague, Cheryl Lightfoot, who's at U Toronto in politics, who's writing a book about apologies. And from apologizing to indigenous peoples, but it goes way back into, West Germany apologizing and further back. But what does that really do? And there's a sense, I believe, that we are probably not critical enough about thinking about this global level of justice as in a certain sense, is something that's difficult to attain. And that in essence kind of frustrates us rather than this individual thing that can move slowly, but it is us. It is something that we can kind of control. And it's not thinking about in terms of whether or not what's going on in the other side of the world is really about us and our own psychic well-being. That said, how healthy does one individual have to be at that level, the individual level, to engage in trying to rectify their own world, right? Like, how well do you need to be to then come into negotiations with the settler state? I don't know. Like, that's a threshold that we don't know as well. Or do we just have to assume we're always going to be wounded, this is always going to be the case, and we just go forward with that acknowledgement of being incomplete, which is, I guess, a real bleak way to end answering that question. But thank you.
Okay, our last question.
Hi, I'm Peter. I promise to make this really quick. Thank you for an inspiring talk. I also really like this point of taking seriously that trauma is for someone and that's kind of distinct from what happened to them, and shift the focus to there when you want healing. I was wondering if there's a pitfall, and if yes, I also would like you to maybe mention how we can avoid that, of that focus on the trauma kind of residing for the person and not so much in the injustice itself. If there's a pitfall of that, making us silence them. So you were mentioning this, the tears make you not be able to see. Can that make us say to the civil rights activists that they're just traumatized, and that the point they're making is not, it's just a trauma reaction, for example? Or can we kind of lose the focus on the actual injustices happening? I don't know if this is a stupid question or not, but just was wondering this.
No, it's a great question, because are there any claims to rights among those who have been aggrieved that you can't just dismiss as saying that that's just traumatic reenactments and you're never going to get that? But you have to put that in the face of what apologies from society, let's say, using this example, might be good enough to actually have salience for those who have been wronged. And then are those politically possible? I don't know. Perhaps, right? But there's this real kind of sinister quality to it that you've very delicately made contact with, which is like, well, you can just disregard everyone's rights and you should not expect anything of society because you might be re-traumatizing yourself. That you might go to something, whether it be an individual or a society, and ask for something that is not present or that they can't give. And that kind of, I don't have an answer to that, but it's certainly a major dilemma with this. Like, what can we expect of other people's? And it can't just be like, what is it, the quote from Melville, which is like, we live as we dream alone, right? And this idea of hearkening back to Monica's point about like, where do you go with these grievances if you have to keep them to yourself? So thank you for a really great question.
And thank you, Professor Orr. Is Professor George Tsai, who is an associate professor of philosophy here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and he'll be talking to us about the aftermath of wrongdoing from cross-cultural perspective. Let's welcome Professor Tsai.
All right, thank you, Sean, and thank you all for being here. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge Tamara Albertini, Peter Hershog, Roger Ames, and Nick Janowitz for their leadership and significant efforts, and to the graduate students for their indispensable support this week. It's often been said that Western philosophy, reflecting Western ways of life, is individualistic in its orientation. By contrast, early Confucian philosophy, reflecting a more communal, collectivist form of life in early China, is relational. This contrast shows up in different areas of thought in these traditions. Consider, for example, conceptions of selfhood or the self. So here's Henry Rosemont writing on the Confucian conception of the self. There can be no me in isolation to be considered abstractly. I am the totality of roles I live in relation to specific others. Taken collectively, they weave for each of us a unique pattern of personal identity, such that if some of my roles change, the others will of necessity change also, literally making me a different person. Roger Ames offers a similar characterization in his book, Confucian Role Ethics. There is no self, no soul, no discrete individual behind our complex and dynamic habits of conduct. Each of us is irreducibly social as the sum of the role we live, not play, in our relationships and transactions with others. Now, we may not all agree with Rosemont and Ames's characterization of the Confucian self. That is, with the notion that for the Confucians, each of us is simply the sum of our relationships. Still, we can all accept that Confucians tend to think of selfhood in terms that make more salient the self's relationship to other selves, the self's role in these relationships, and the self's role within a community. This understanding certainly fits some broader aspects of the Confucian outlook and social world. Confucians emphasize the importance of relationships in human life. Central to Confucianism is the idea that individuals are fundamentally connected through relationships. And these relationships involve specific roles and responsibilities for their participants, roles and responsibilities that enable personal cultivation and social harmony. By contrast, those in the modern West tend to privilege or emphasize the individual over the community, and are more inclined to think of themselves as unitary selves, not as a relational network node. In this context, many relationships, or many more relationships, are optional and potentially ephemeral. Indeed, there's a marketplace for finding friends, business partners, and marriage partners, and individuals have a significant range of choice in these domains. Within this sort of context, cultivating a unique self, emphasizing those traits that will make you interesting to possible friends, possible mates, possible business partners, thus takes on a kind of importance. The generalizations that I've offered so far of Confucian relationality and Western individualism are just that, right? Generalizations. When we look carefully, of course, we find in early China forms of individualism, such as the ideas of Yang Zhu and Zhuangzi. And in the West, we find ideas that affirm our relationality and our relational embeddedness, such as communitarian and socialist thought. My project today is to explore an aspect of Confucian ethics that is, I'll hope to persuade you, surprisingly individualistic. This individualism, or better put, independence of spirit, shows up when we consider how Confucians approach the aftermath of moral failure, and consider how the Confucian approach contrasts with an influential Western approach we find in the modern contemporary West. So here's the plan for the rest of my talk. I want to consider Confucian and modern Western perspectives on the aftermath of moral failure. I'll argue that in an important respect, the Confucian ideal regarding the aftermath is more individualistic and more independently spirited than the Western ideal, which is surprisingly more relational, social, interactive, and dialogical, at least in the way it's conceiving, ideally, how the wrongdoer and the wronged are to relate to each other. Finally, I'll consider how this difference is linked to different conceptions of self-respect and selfhood. And to give you a preview, what I'll suggest is actually that the individualist spirit to which the Confucians approach the aftermath of wrongdoing is actually going to be linked to their more relational conception of the self. So I'm interested in the constellation of attitudes, emotions, and practices that appear after moral failure, and specifically interpersonal wrongdoing. Examples of the concepts and practices that I have in mind include blame, anger, resentment, guilt, shame, remorse, regret, repentance, disappointment, apology, forgiveness, reparations, reconciliation, and redemption. I'm only going to speak on some of these today. As a way into the Confucian perspective on the aftermath of moral failure, I want to consider Guangloi Shun's work on Confucian perspectives on anger and forgiveness. So Shun attended the last East-West Philosophers Conference in 2016 and gave a plenary address titled Ethics Without Forgiveness. And I'll be drawing in particular today on 3 papers by Shun that bear on what I've called the aftermath of moral failure. And these papers are Resentment and Forgiveness in Confucian Thought, on Anger, an essay in Confucian Moral Psychology, and Anger, Compassion, and the Distinction Between First and Third Person, a more recently published paper. Shun is struck by the absence of discussions of forgiveness in Confucian writings, and he sets out to make sense of this fact, especially given the comparative prominence in Western ethical thought of forgiveness and related attitudes such as resentment. To appreciate Shun's analysis, though, we must first grasp the centrality of resentment and forgiveness in contemporary ethical thought. And there's perhaps no better place to turn for this than to P.F. Strawson's classic paper, Freedom and Resentment, published in 1962. Probably the most cited paper in the moral psychology literature in the last 60 years, at least in Anglophone analytic discussions. Strawson's view represents an outlook with many adherents, certainly among contemporary Anglophone analytic moral philosophers. But I want to emphasize that Strawson's view is not just philosophical theory, or if it is, it's meant to be theory that speaks to our lived ethical experience, perhaps lived ethical experience for people of a certain time and place. Strawson is interested in the moral sentiments central to the human relationships that give our lives meaning and texture. So think in the first instance of friendship, love, and collaboration. He's interested in how these sentiments relate to our practices of holding one another responsible or accountable in these relationships. A central case of such sentiments, Strawson argues, is resentment. And he characterizes resentment as a reaction to injury or indifference. It's an instance of a larger class of reactive attitudes that rest on and reflect an expectation of and demand for the manifestation of a certain degree of goodwill or regard on the part of other human beings towards ourselves, or at least an absence of the manifestation of indifferent disregard. In short, resentment is based on what is due to oneself, what we are owed. It targets the wrongdoer's failure to satisfy a normative expectation for a certain degree and kind of goodwill or regard. Now, it's often argued that resentment is linked to the value of self-respect. The link involves the idea that wrongdoing involves insult, the implicit message that it's okay for one to be mistreated. So consider Geoffrey Murphy's claim about wrongdoing having the elocutionary force of insults to the victim's worth. So he writes, moral injuries done to us are also messages, symbolic communications. Intentional wrongdoing insults us and attempts, sometimes successfully, to degrade us. So the implicit insult of wrongdoing threatens our moral standing and our sense of moral worth. To resent someone who has wronged one is to stand up for oneself against such threats to one's moral standing, claims, rights, interests, concerns, and worth. It is to respond emotionally and through communicative blame that gives expression and communication of those emotions as a self-respecting person would. In Western philosophy, forgiveness is widely defined as forswearing, giving up on or letting go of resentment. And one paradigm form of the practice of forgiveness, which we might call moral justice forgiveness, following Miranda Fricker, takes forgiveness as fitting or appropriate only if the wrongdoer sincerely repents. That is, feels remorse, acknowledges wrongdoing, and makes amends for the harm caused. Sincere repentance, according to Murphy, expresses something like the following. I no longer stand behind the wrongdoing, and I want to be separated from it. I stand with you in condemning it. The idea is that sincere repentance makes forgiveness, forgoing resentment, appropriate or fitting, because repentance severs the wrongdoer from the wrongful deed and retracts the threat expressed by the wrongdoing. Resentment, repentance, and forgiveness are important pieces to the process of moral repair, according to this outlook. So consider what I'll call the reactive trajectory, which is an ideal for how the wrongdoer and wrong work together, or might work together, in the aftermath of wrongdoing to achieve more repair and create a greater shared moral understanding. So wrongdoer W and victim V, right? So this is how things might play out, doesn't always play out this way, and I think this is one way in which things might play out well. The way in which it might play out is less straightforward than I've represented it here. So W, wrongdoer wrongs V, V blames, resents W, W feels regret, remorse, and guilt. W repents, apologizes, makes amends to V, V forgives W, and W and V reconcile. The relationship is repaired, and a greater overlap in their respective moral understanding might be achieved than prior to the wronging. Notice that this process involves quite a bit of moral communication between W and V, and even negotiation between them to sort out the norms that are relevant or the norms that ought to be in place to govern their relationship. Okay, so now that we have a rough picture of the core elements of an influential Western picture of the aftermath of moral failure, I want to return to Shun's reflections on the Confucian perspective. Shun points out that Confucians generally regard resentment as an emotion one should rise above. Yun is the term closest to resentment in classical China. In his words, on the Confucian view, when one is wrongfully injured, the focus of one's attention should be on the quality of one's response, rather than on how one's standing is challenged by the offender. Yes, I'm emphasizing that last part of that construction. So notice that on the Strawsonian resentment, as I've just described a moment ago, relies more or less precisely on the thought that one's moral standing has been challenged. Right? It's often been said that the constitutive thought of resentment is the thought that I've been wronged. On the Confucian view, Yun might sometimes be appropriate as a response to someone else's wrongful treatment of us. However, those feelings should be directed at the wrongful treatment, rather than at the fact that such treatment was directed at us. According to the Confucian ideal, we should not attach special significance to wrongs and insults directed to us. So our response to an instance in which we've been wronged and insulted should be no different than when wronging and insults happen elsewhere in the world. So resentment of the sort that Strawson characterizes would not be experienced by the Confucian morally exemplary agent. All of this helps to make sense of the absence of an equivalent in classical Chinese for forgiveness, especially moral justice forgiveness that should be given only if the offender repents. So that's the basic contour of Shun's argument. Recall that according to the Western view I discussed earlier, resentment is linked with self-respect. A readiness to feel resentment is bound up with having self-respect, a preparedness to protest wrongful treatment and stand up for oneself against insult, the implicit message that it's okay for one to be mistreated. Does this mean then that the Confucian counsel against a readiness to feel resentment when wronged indicates a lack of concern for self-respect? Well, the answer is no. I think it's better to say that the Confucians had a different way of conceiving of self-respect. Confucian self-respect is based on one's own proper conduct and ethical qualities, not on how others treat one. More generally, the Confucian ideal for responding after being wronged is to direct ethical attention to oneself. You should ask yourself whether you are fulfilling your relationship role responsibilities and focus on your own conduct and how best you can move forward. So I want to now give some textual support to the characterization that I've been offering. So in Analects 1.4, one of Confucius's disciples says the following: in my dealing with others, have I in any way failed to be dutiful? In my interactions with friends and associates, have I failed to be trustworthy? So notice there's kind of focus on the self. In Mengzi 4.8.4, Mengzi said, if one loves others and they are not affectionate to oneself, one should examine one's own benevolence. If one rules over others and they are unruly, one should examine one's own wisdom. If one treats others with propriety and they do not respond, one should examine one's own reverence. If in one's actions one does not succeed, one should always seek for it in oneself. If one was proper oneself, the world would turn to him. Mengzi, 4B 28. Here's a person who is harsh to me. A gentleman, right, a morally exemplary agent, a virtuous person in this situation will invariably examine themselves and say, I must not be benevolent. I must be lacking in propriety. How else could this situation have come upon me? If they examine themselves and is benevolent, and if he examines himself and is benevolent, and if he examines himself and has propriety, yet the other person is still harsh, a gentleman will invariably examine himself saying, I must not be loyal. We also find similar ideas in Sun Tzu. So in 30.5, Master Zeng said, if I travel the same route as others, but I am not loved by them, then I must not be genuinely humane. When I have close contact with others, but they do not respect me, then I must not be respectful of age. When in financial dealings, I am not trusted, then I must not be genuinely trustworthy. For my purposes, the key point to take away from these passages is that the Confucian direction of ethical attention in the aftermath of being wrong is back on oneself, on one's own ethical comportment and conduct, rather than on others' view and treatment of one. So there's a kind of inward direction of ethical attention in the face of ill treatment. So what should we make of this comparative difference in the direction of ethical attention and how we understand the basis of self-respect? Well, what interests me is that the Western Strawsonian approach is in an important way more social than the Confucian approach. So I think this complicates the generalization with which we began the talk. Self-respect is taken to depend in part on other people, on their regard and treatment of us. The social character of the Strawsonian approach is also reflected in the social practices in the aftermath of moral failure. There's an ideal of seeking moral repair between wrongdoer and wrong party through interpersonal moral communication between them. By contrast, Confucianism expresses, and perhaps the difference is a difference of degree, expresses a greater independence of spirit, a kind of self-reliance, if you will. Self-respect is based primarily on how we respond to wrongdoing and on our own ethical conduct more generally, and not on whether others have given us our due. And I think there's also a kind of independence that we can find in the Confucian themes of self-reflection, learning from sagehood ideal, and self-cultivation. Right? So notice these don't usually involve interactions or working out differences between the wrongdoer and the wronged. Although I don't have time to argue further, I will end with a speculation. I suspect that the Confucian spirit of independence in the aftermath of moral failure is linked to the Confucian relational self, a conception of the self in which the self has a relatively secure place in relatively fixed and stable roles, in relationships that are often hierarchical, but not experienced as objectionably so. The Western Strawsonian approach to the aftermath of moral failure is linked to a notion of selfhood that depends notably on other people's attitudes, on recognition, respect, and regard. And here I'll highlight something that my colleague Jonathan Find talked about in his presentation about the centrality of recognition in Western philosophical discourse. So in the Western approach, we have a notion of selfhood that depends on other people's attitudes in a social world in which relationship roles are more flexible and more fluid, thereby requiring negotiation, where moral equality is an ideal, but its realization remains insecure. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Okay, we have some time for questions. Okay, so I'm going to start with Esther. 1, 2, 3.
Thanks, George. I really appreciate. I was very interested in your setup, and I appreciate the talk. One thing that I mean, obviously, you're kind of doing a descriptive project, right? So it's like this is what is, rather than how it should be, or the kind of advantages or something. But one of the immediate disadvantages that jumps out at me at this, what you characterize as Confucian approach, is a sort of the danger of blaming yourself for. Like sort of victim blaming, like something bad happens to me, and it's definitely my fault. The good part is that you don't project, what you might have done wrong onto other people. But the bad part is, sometimes it's not your fault. But I kind of also have a sort of your own textual evidence might help you with that problem, because Mencius 4b28, which you cited, it goes on after that. So the part that you've left out is, okay, I keep examining myself. What did I do? What did I do wrong? And in the end, it says, well, if you can't find anything, you can discount that person as no better than an animal. and my students are always like very troubled by this. So I wondered, like, what do you do with that, like, continuation?
So thank you. On your first observation, I agree. You characterized my project as being a descriptive one, and yes, I probably would prefer the term diagnostic, trying to diagnose and make sense of a difference. And you're also right about the Mencius passage I quote. He does go on and say that in these cases, you might view someone as a beast. And I thought that was distracting, so I left it off. But I think it actually further supports my point. I mean, there is a dehumanizing lens by which one views the other person or actually views one's wrongdoer in those cases. And I think, again, there is that distancing or viewing the other with dehumanizing contempt actually moves one further away from dialogue with the other party to try to reconcile and to also achieve greater moral common ground. Yeah.
Thank you.
No. Carson, behind you. Sorry. It's not your turn.
Thank you for your presentation. Yeah, I really, thankful for your kind of inversion of our common sense of Confucianism and Western culture. Always I'm thinking that Confucianism is relational, Western peoples are individualistic, the two binary, and it's too convenient. Actually every cultures, every nations, actually they need both. But seems like simple binary image of the individualism and relationality is I think it's like a kind of Western product, because they need when after the modernization they need some kind of a relational concept, and then they found it in another kind of religion and cultures, and then they just kind of made it up. But the thing is that all those you kind of inverted, show that the inverted image of Confucianism according to our common sense, but still, for me, just binary division of individualism and relationality. Perhaps something we need is like different paradigm, always independence and the relationality is crisscrossing things. In a Confucian culture, sometimes relationality doesn't work, always better way. So, what do you think?
Thank you. So, yes, I mean, my take is that these generalizations are perhaps exaggerated, and I mean they are just generalizations. So, insofar as we recognize them as generalizations, I think they're generally unproblematic, because I think there is a grain of truth that they represent. But of course, right, they exaggerate certain features or overlook certain features, and it's my aim to try to complicate these generalizations by looking carefully at different elements and aspects of the outlook and try to identify, right, within the Confucian outlook, certain more independently or individualist strands and point out aspects of the Western approach that might seem actually more social.
Hello, my name is Yu Izumi from Nanzan University. I work on the philosophy of language, so this is beyond my expertise. But so could you say a bit more about the contrast between idealized human beings, sagehood, and like actual human beings like us, people on the ground? So I wonder if the Straussonian project really aims at depicting idealized or idealizations of some sort, or it aims at depicting people like us. For instance, we insult each other, right? But a sage wouldn't insult others, I suppose. So I wonder if, could you say a bit more about the differences between those two projects, or if there is any such difference?
Right. Okay. Good. Thank you. I mean, my reference to ideals of Confucian sagehood was to point out that, at least with respect to the aftermath of moral failure or wrongdoing, the experience for the victim or the person who's been wronged seems a bit more solitary. So they're supposed to just reflect on themselves, and where and when they go beyond themselves, they're looking to these ideals, right, that the sages represent, rather than engaging in dialogue and communication with the victim, with the perpetrator or the wrongdoer. The idea of the reactive trajectory as an ideal, I mean, I mentioned that as an ideal because I wanted to highlight that things don't always play out as I represented it, but it's one way in which things might play out well between the wrongdoer and the wronged.
This will be our final question.
Okay. Is this on? Thank you. That was really interesting, and I realize you're quite limited in what you can do in such a short talk. I just wanted to make a couple of bibliographical suggestions. So one on resentment in early China. You might want to check out Michael Ng's book on the vulnerability of integrity, which is a wider array of textual evidence about when that comes up and what it applies to, and when resolution is hard to come by. And then on the Western side, you might also want to check out Kate Mann's Down Girl, on the way in which these things are socially situated and not quite so individualist as Strawson's original treatment. So anyway, I think both of those might be of use to you, depending on how far you want to go with this. But thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, I mean, to the others in the audience, I also recommend Michael Ng's very insightful work on Yuan. And as your reference to Kate Mann's work brings out, I mean, there of course are other traditions of thought within the West, like feminist thought, which really does emphasize this relational natures. Thank you.
Thank you, George. So for our final talk, we're going to hear from Professor Benjamin Kieswetter from Bielefeld University in Germany. And the UH community here has had the benefit of having Ben as a visiting scholar this semester. It's been very great. And he's going to talk to us about what we may expect of each other. Let's welcome Professor Kieswetter.
Finally, LA. Wonderful. Thanks so much for having me. If you want a handout for this talk, it's just going to be the slides. You can download it with this fancy QR code or with this link. Let me start with a little preview of what I'm going to do in the next 25 minutes. My aim is to present an analysis of moral obligations, overall moral obligation in terms of reasons. That's a project that's sometimes called deontic buck passing. It passes the buck from deontic properties to reason properties, my central thesis will be that for A to be morally required to phi is for two conditions to hold. It's for A to have decisive reasons for the action, and for these reasons to be also reasons, sufficient reasons for everyone else to expect the agent to perform that action. So in a slogan, the realm of moral obligation is the realm of what we may expect of each other, hence the title of this talk. So this is probably going to be a little bit more foundational than other talks of this panel, but it like emphasizes the morality as the social or relational aspects of morality. Here's an overview. Just going to start with explaining a little bit this kind of deontic backpassing project. And I'm going to zoom into like two particular ways of spelling out this project, a rationalist and a sentimentalist way. Going to stress some of the advantages and disadvantages of both of these approaches before I present my own view, the expectation view. I'll explain the view, and then I'll again emphasize some virtues of the view in the fourth section before wrapping up the results. All right, start with deontic backpassing. What do deontic backpasses, what do? They want to analyze deontically normative properties or concepts. I'm going to stay neutral on these two readings, whether we're concerned with properties or concepts, such as, for example, rightness, wrongness, obligatoriness, permissibility, oughtness, being or required or having a claim right in terms of reasons. What are reasons? I take reasons to be like the pros and cons that we weigh in deliberation about what to do, also deliberation about what to believe or what to feel. So here's an example. Perhaps you've considered the question whether to visit the East-West Philosopher Conference in Hawaii, and there seem to be like reasons for doing this. It's going to be interesting philosophy, the weather will be nice, you might meet nice colleagues, and the reasons against doing it. It's a long distance. Hawaii might be far away depending on from where you start. Hawaii is quite expensive, etc., etc. You can see how the story goes. So there are reasons for doing it, there are reasons against doing it. You can weigh these reasons and coming to a conclusion. So that's what I take to be reasons. I think it's clear that that's some sort of pre-theoretical notion. It's a pre-theoretical notion that everyone actually who has ever made a reflective decision by weighing considerations against each other is already familiar with. That's, I think, very attractive about this notion, and also on focusing on this notion in analyzing deontically normative concepts. So here is an example of such a backpassing analysis that some philosophers have suggested, among them Mark Schroeder and Derek Parfit. So they have both claimed that for it to be the case that A ought to do something, just is for it to be the case that the reasons for doing it are stronger than the reasons against doing it. Okay? So here you have an informative analysis of a deontically normative concept, the concept of ought, in terms of this pre-theoretical notion of a reason. If that is successful, that's very attractive because it means that we can explain what it means that somebody ought to do something to everyone who is capable of making a reflective decision. That's what's attractive about this. It provides us with an informative analysis of a deontic phenomenon, and it also might contribute to a more unified understanding of the normative, right? If we can understand the deontic in terms of reasons, we can start to think about a unified story about the normative. Perhaps other normative concepts and properties can be explained in terms of reasons as well. All right, so much for the general deontic backpassing project, and let's focus on two ways of doing that, the rationalist and the sentimentalist. So the rationalist will explain moral requirements, the moral requirements the agent A is under, by appealing to A's reasons for the required action. Okay, so an immediate implication is that there is reason for performing the action that you're morally required to perform, perhaps even most reason. That's why it's called rationalist. Now, this has some attractions. I find that an attractive implication. It explains the first personal authority of moral obligations, why we take ourselves to have reason to act in ways that we're morally obliged to act. And it also does so in a way that provides, I think, a very attractive answer to the why be moral challenge, right? If moral requirements are already constituted by reasons, then we do not need like extra moral reasons to be moral, because moral requirements are already come automatically with reasons. That's nice. However, there are also problems for the rationalist. One problem is the problem of supererogation. We might have most moral reason to perform actions that go beyond the call of duty, that we are not morally required to perform. So a classic example by Horgan and Timmons, like it would be very nice of you, very kind to invite your widowed elderly neighbor to a baseball game. And that seems something you might have most moral reason to do, but still it doesn't feel like that's a moral obligation. You're still morally permitted not to do that, right? That's a problem. Another problem is the what we might call the socio-emotional dimension of morality, right? Whether I conform to moral obligation is not just my business. It's the business of other people. It's something that other people can demand of me. It's something that other people will have emotional reactions, as George emphasized in his talks as well, when I don't do that, right? And that contrasts with other aspects of practical reason, right? Suppose you have chronic neck tension and you have decisive reasons to exercise daily, so to speak. It just doesn't follow that other people can demand of me that I exercise daily, that other people can have these kind of emotional reactions if I don't exercise daily. So there's something particular about moral obligations that comes in, that there's this socio-emotional dimension to it. And it's not clear how the rationalist who tells us that morality is just the realm of practical reasons can actually explain that. Now turn to another kind of story, the sentimentalist story. The sentimentalist explains the moral obligations of A, not in terms of the reasons for A to perform certain actions, but in terms of the reasons that others have to react to A, right? To have these kinds of reactive attitudes that Strawson emphasizes in his paper that might be so to constitute blame. Now this, of course, is a view that has very much the ability to explain the affective and social dimension of moral normativity, and it also avoids these kind of extensional problems with supererogation. It doesn't seem that in the cases of supererogation, we blame people for not doing what they have most moral reason to do. So these are advantages, but there are also problems with sentimentalism. The first thing that I want to say is that it seems that moral obligations have first personal authority, and we would say also primarily first personal authority. They are in the first instance normative for the agent. And that is something that sentimentalism, again, cannot explain. For sentimentalists, the normativity of moral obligations consists in there being reasons for others to react towards wrongdoing, right? And not for performing certain kind of actions. Another point is that reactive attitudes seem to be backwards looking, right? And moral obligations have an essential forward looking, guiding character, right? They are used in deliberation about what to do, in advising people what they ought to do, and also in maybe in exerting pressure on people to do that. These are forward looking, guiding dimensions that the sentimentalist, backward looking analysis doesn't seem to get right. So let's turn to the third view, the expectation view, which I aim to defend. So the proposal is that for A to be morally required is for A to have decisive reasons to perform that action. This, I think, is right about the rationalist analysis. But it's second to be the case that these reasons, the reasons that make it the case that I have decisive reasons to phi, are also because sufficient agent-neutral reasons to expect the agent to phi. Here's some how I define these terms. A set of reasons is decisive if it's weightier than any set of competing reasons. A set of reasons is sufficient if there's no weightier set of competing reasons. And a reason is agent neutral if and only if it's necessarily shared by all agents capable of responding to. So let me just go through an example to see how the view works, or actually 3 examples. So suppose, first of all, you have promised your neighbor to take her to the baseball game, right? In this case, you have a promissory reason. Given that there are no stronger reasons against doing it, that reason will be decisive. And I will say, so the first condition is satisfied. You have decisive reasons to perform that act. But I will also say, like, the fact that you've promised to perform that action is a sufficient reason for others to expect you to do that. And so the analysis will yield the result that you're morally required to perform that action, to keep your promise. Now, take a second case. Again, you've promised to take your neighbor to the baseball game, but there is something important, an important other duty coming up, maybe a duty of childcare, say. In this case, you don't have decisive reason to keep your promise. Actually, you should break your promise, right? And the first condition isn't satisfied, and you're not morally required, according to the view, to perform that act. Now, a third kind of case, and that was the original case that I brought up, is a case in which you haven't promised to take your neighbor to the baseball game, but it would just be a nice thing to do, right? In this case, it might be that the first condition is correct. You might still have decisive reason to take your neighbor to the baseball game, but I would say the fact that it would be a nice thing to do and like a kind action is not a fact that gives others reason to expect you to perform that action. And so the second condition isn't satisfied, and you're not morally required to perform that act. Now, I've been using the term expectation a lot, obviously, so let me say a little bit about that. What do I have in mind by an expectation? I think we should distinguish at least 2 senses of an expectation, a predictive and what we might call a prescriptive sense. One is belief-like. It involves some sort of credence that the agent will perform some action. The other is more desire-like. It involves somehow the desire that the agent will act in a certain way. And these 2 notions are, I think, independent, right? Think of an example. Whenever Trump opens his mouth, I expect him in the predictive sense to lie. Of course, I expect him to lie. But still, I don't expect him in the prescriptive sense, of course, to lie. On the contrary, I expect him to lie, not to lie in the prescriptive sense, even though I expect him in the predictive sense to lie, right? These notions are just very different and should be kept apart. And of course, the notion I focus on is the prescriptive one, the desire-like. However, expectations aren't just merely desires that an agent will perform. They are particular desires. They involve dispositions to reactive emotions, exactly the kind of emotions that we've already been addressing here: indignation, resentment, guilt, and maybe personal disappointment. So if I expect you to phi, I desire that you phi, but I desire that in a way that makes me disposed to be disappointed personally if you don't phi. Another point that we might want to say here is that expectations are constitutively connected to the speech act of a demand. Right? So speech act theory tells us that speech acts are kind of constitutively connected to attitudes that we purport to express, right? If we assert something, then we purport to express a belief, which means that the speech act will be insincere if we don't believe what we assert. And similarly, we might say that a demand is purports to express an expectation, kind of insincere if we demand something which we don't expect the agent to do. So much for the content of the view. Now let me stress some of its virtues. The first virtue is that it seems to combine strengths of the rationalist and sentimentalist views without having the kinds of problems. We have the aspect of the rationalist view, the first personal authority of morality and the attractive response to the why be moral challenge. But we also have this kind of socio-emotional aspect of moral obligations because according to this view, moral obligations are constituted by reasons for everyone to have certain kind of attitudes that dispose us to have certain kind of emotions. But I think that apart from these combining effects, there are also additional virtues of the expectation. So one virtue that I want to emphasize is that I think the view presents an attractive response to what's sometimes called the paradox of supererogation, the question how it could be morally permissible to refrain from an action that is favored by the balance of moral reasons, right? That's a famous paradox or puzzle, at least in moral philosophy. And I think the view provides an interesting answer to that. Now, recall the rationalist seems even incompatible with supererogation, right? The sentimentalist seems compatible with supererogation, but it also doesn't provide like an illuminating account of why there could be something like supererogation. Now, I think the expectation view does that because the expectation view can say, look, it can be permissible to refrain from actions favored by the balance of moral reasons because moral obligations are not only constituted by most reason to act, but also by reasons for expectations. And in cases of supererogations, we don't have these sufficient reasons for expectations. There are different cases here. The one I focused on was the baseball kind of invitation case, and that would be a case in which such reasons are missing, and that just explains why there can be such a thing as supererogation. Another, and I think that's going to be the last thing I want to focus on in this talk, is imperatival character of morality. So perhaps you've come across Anscombe's famous thesis that the concept of a moral obligation is unintelligible and should be jettisoned outside of a context of a divine command conception of ethics. That's a thesis that not many moral philosophers have accepted, but many would, I think, accept that there's an interesting challenge here that Anscombe raises. And the challenge might be put that, like, we want to make sense of this kind of imperatival character of moral obligation. So we want to know how there can be demands, how moral obligations can be demands without there being somebody who demands something of us, without there being, for example, a God that issues commands or demands. We want an answer to that question. We want also to know how it comes that moral obligations amount to demands in general, because other kind of aspects of practical reason are not demand-like, right? You might have most reason to eat chocolate ice cream, for example. It just doesn't follow that there is a demand that you eat chocolate ice cream. So there's something particular about moral obligations, this imperatival character, that we want an explanation. Now there's, of course, one huge group in moral philosophy, voluntarist view, which aim to provide such an explanations. According to those views, moral obligations derive from authoritative acts like divine commands, giving oneself a law, the demands of other persons, or the demands of society. I'm not going to discuss these views here, but I think you can see immediately that they will all have kind of very controversial presuppositions and also potential problems with extensional adequacy. And so it's worth looking for an alternative explanation of imperatival character, and I think the expectation view yields such an explanation. So here's a proposal. The expectation view says that moral obligations entail sufficient reasons for expectations, right? That's just an implication of the view. Now, I said already that it's constitutive of demands, of the speech act of a demand, that that speech act purports to express an expectation. That's the second premise. Now, here's a plausible assumption, I think, about speech acts in general. For every speech act S that constitutively purports to express an attitude A, the speech act is appropriate, we might say correct or fitting, if and only if there are sufficient reasons for the attitude that it purports to express. And from these assumptions, you get the conclusion that if there are sufficient reasons for expecting A to phi, then it's appropriate to demand of A that she phis. And from this, you get the conclusion that moral obligations entail the appropriateness of a demand. So what you get here from the expectation view is a fundamental explanation of the imperatival character of moral obligations without any kind of voluntarist presupposition, which I think should be attractive. Okay, let me briefly wrap up. I've tried to argue or kind of make attractive at least that moral requirements can be analyzed in terms of reasons. Such an analysis, I think, is generally attractive because it's informative and it contributes to unified understanding of normativity. I hope that the expectation view in particular illuminates several features of moral obligations, including their first personal authority, as well as the social and affective dimension. And it seems to be capable of solving some pressing problems in moral philosophy, including the why be moral challenge, the paradox of supererogation, and Anscombe's challenge to modern moral philosophy. So much for now. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, so hands up, please. Okay, so we're going to start right here with you, sir. And then 2 in the back and 3 here. And then the others, we'll see if we have time.
Thank you for this really clear, precise talk. I'm Gus Law from the University of Chicago. Just a clarificatory question. I was trying to understand how there's need to speak of expect. You're explaining that on your way to the end. Could you say more with respect to the supererogatory duty case, like how it explains, your view explains why I don't have a moral requirement to do something. Can you just say more to help me? Thanks.
Okay, so the basic assumption that I will have to make, and which I hope is plausible on first order normative grounds, is that in such cases of supererogation, you don't have sufficient reason to expect the agent to act in that way. Okay, so consider the widowed neighbor case. It would be kind to take her to the baseball game, but it's not that other people are justified in expecting you to do that. That's the assumption that I'm making about that case, which I hope you share on just because it's intuitively plausible. If you share that assumption with me, then the expectation view will explain why there is no moral requirement. Because even if in such a case you have most moral reason to do that thing, you have most moral reason to invite your neighbor to the baseball game, we've already agreed that there's not sufficient reason, that reasons are not sufficient reasons for others to expect you to do it. And because the presence of such sufficient reasons for expectations is a necessary condition for a moral obligation, it will turn out to be morally permissible not to take your neighbor to the game.
So no sufficient reason for anyone else, even if they know every relevant fact about my situation.
Yes. So, in fact, I mean, I only need the assumption that there's no sufficient agent-neutral reason to expect. There might even be agent-relative reasons for certain kind of people to expect. I don't think that's very plausible in this case to assume. But yeah, that would be independent of what people know about you. So maybe if that needs more support, expectations are dispositions to blame, dispositions to have this kind of personal disappointment in a person. And I think that maybe that just doesn't feel right in cases of supererogations, to blame the person and be in this way personally disappointed.
Yeah, I'm Kelvin from Toronto Metropolitan University. Thank you so much for the talk. I enjoyed it a lot. My roommate and I were just talking about supererogation yesterday, actually. So yeah, but my question is not related to that, sorry. So when you talk of expectations, I can't help but think of Lewisian kind of expectations, conventions, and coordination problems. So I guess that's two problems there. One question is about the second prong for moral obligation. You mentioned it's agent neutral, but then you also mentioned that some of the attractive points is that it's social, emotionally related. But if it's related to social emotion, then it seems to be socially relative as well. So how can there is there something contradictory happening with being agent neutral but also socially related? So that's the first question. And again, the second question would be about, even in agent neutral situations, can there be times where we don't know what to expect, such as in coordination games, of which there can be multiple, let's say, equilibrium. So you don't know what to expect and what to make in those situations.
Second question.
Let's say in the prisoner's dilemma, maybe I actually don't know, or what to expect from the other, like that, yeah.
I mean, I think that the second question I thought that these kind of questions appear for expectations in the predictive sense, while we're talking here about the expectations in the prescriptive sense. You would have to maybe come back to me if I misunderstood your point here. But let me say something about your first question. Yeah, so I think that, so there is a social dimension because my moral obligations are, in a way, the concern of other people. Other people have, in virtue of me being morally obliged to perform a certain, other people have reasons to react to me in a certain way. But indeed, it's part of the view here that these reasons for expectations are agent neutral. So in principle, everyone has them. Of course, not everyone. It doesn't make sense for everyone to have these kind of expectations. They will have to stand in certain kind of epistemic relationships to me. They will have to at least know what's going on and be in certain kind of proximity. But in principle, I think everyone is justified in expecting agents to conform with morality. So there is a social dimension because it relates you to everyone else, but it isn't social in the sense that it relies on particular established relationships. So I think that there is a particular realm of morality which is kind of narrower than the one I focused on, which is relational morality in the sense of having to do with duties that we owe to others or that are kind of partial duties of friendships or relationships. But this is, so what I was focusing on a broader concept of morality that is already social in this sense, but it need not be relational in this more narrow sense.
Hi, Laura Specker-Sullivan, Fordham University, and I have a question that relates to both the rationalist view and the expectation view. So I might have missed something, but in solving the paradox of supererogation, it seems like both accounts are relying heavily on this language of stronger reasons and weightier reasons, right? So the rationalist view says they're stronger, the expectation view says they're weightier, and it uses that to determine decisiveness and sufficiency. And so it seems like without specifying the criteria for stronger or weightier, it's not actually solving the problem in either case.
So, I mean, first of all, the rationalist doesn't solve the problem at all. It's so, as I have presented it here, it's just incompatible with the phenomenon, because the rationalist says, like, what you're morally obliged to do is what you have most moral reason to do. But the assumption is, in cases of supererogation, you have most moral reason to perform an act, but are still not required. And I think I would like to capture that, and the expectation view captures that. Now, of course, there's an interesting philosophical question: what does it make it the case that one reason is stronger than the other, outweighs the other? And I haven't said anything about that. So I take the idea that there are reasons that have certain kind of weights that can be weighed against each other, and that can be stand in these kind of relations of being stronger than each other. That is all like taken for granted in this talk. But it's also taken for granted by the proponent of supererogation, because the proponent of supererogation just says, look, we have cases where we have most moral reason, but still are not required, right? So here we are all on the same board, that it makes sense to talk in this way. But obviously it is a very interesting question to account for this kind of phenomenon, or to give some sort of theory of weight of reasons, but I haven't tried to do that.
Hi, thanks. I found this really compelling, but I was thrown off by the idea of expectations in the prescriptive sense as desires and as expressing demands. So I can see using it that way. I can also see using, I expect you to do it as something like, I think you ought to do it. And that's not going to be good for you, because that's going to put the buck back on the oughts. I can also see it as something like, I think you have the right kind of reason to do it. Which I was wondering if that would be good enough for you. The reason desire and demand seemed odd is that I thought, from the agent neutral perspective, I might expect you to drive your neighbor to the ball game if you've promised. So let's take the case where, in fact, you ought to, right? You did promise. I expect you to, but I don't desire that you do. It might be kind of nothing to me, or I might wish that you would save room in your car for me instead. It seems strange to say that I demand that you do it. If it's me, or if I'm personally implicated, then, if the obligation is to me or to someone I care about, then I desire and I demand. But it seems psychologizing it too much. Whereas really, when I say, yeah, if you promised, I think any reasonable person would expect that you keep your promise to this person. It seems to me that's much easier to cash out in terms of would think that you ought, or would think that you have a certain kind of reason too. Obviously, you don't want to go the ought route, but I'm wondering why you don't want to go or sort of asking if you'd like to go the reason route.
So is the question that, I guess the challenge would be, is expectation not something purely cognitive rather than non-cognitive? Because it's not so important that it's the desire. So there are, of course, different notions of desire, and I use a very broad notion that all that I would need it involves some sort of non-cognitive pro-attitude towards acting in this way.
So maybe I could phrase it as, why go this non-cognitive? Why think there has to be of course, in many cases there will be, but it seemed to me like the main work, especially when we're going agent neutral, could be done without. I might not have any reactive attitudes towards you if you let down, if you don't fulfill your obligation to somebody else. Or
I mean, of course, so I'm happy with accepting that you could believe that a person is morally obligated without then blaming them for doing the thing or without having any reactive attitudes. That I'm fine with. I would deny that you expect them at least in that sense in which I'm after them to do that thing, because expectations involve these kind of dispositions to reactive attitudes. That's the notion I have. So now, I'm not sure whether this is more than a terminological disagreement. I don't deny that you could use the term expectation in a sense in which it refers only to your purely cognitive beliefs about moral obligations. I hope you agree that you can also use it to the kind of, also non-cognitive attitudes, or at least involving non-cognitive attitudes. And those are the ones I focus on.
can I have one more sec? Yeah, I guess my thought was, what would you lose if you instead said clause 2 doesn't use the word expectation, but rather says something like think that the person has the right kind of reason. Now I'm getting lost about whether that would be decisive or sufficient. So not only does the agent have that reason, but others from an agent neutral perspective think that they have that. What do we add by going the expectation route?
Well, I mean, I guess reasons to think that the person has certain kind of reasons, that would be just epistemic reasons. And whether people have epistemic reasons depends on the evidence, for example, and it doesn't dispose them to any kind of reactive attitudes if they have epistemic reasons for having certain kind of beliefs about other people's reasons. So, and it also is, in a way, it would trivialize. So I think it would, first of all, it would not account for the emotional or affective dimension of moral obligations, and it would trivialize the social dimension because it would just be that everyone has epistemic reasons to have those beliefs because it is the case or because there's evidence, or that doesn't really import like something importantly social about moral obligations.
Thanks.
That wouldn't mark a difference between moral obligations and other rounds of practical reason.
So I'm going to ask a very quick clarificatory question, and then if we have time, we'll have one more question from the audience. Can you say a bit more, because you went through this pretty quickly in your talk, the part about kind of putting the voluntarists to one side. And I guess I wanted to hear a bit more about how, and you went a little ways in addressing this in response to the second question, but how you would differentiate your own view, which relies on the expectations of others alongside having decisive reasons, from species of voluntarism that are themselves quite social. Right, so there are versions of voluntarism that advert to society at large and things of that nature. So how does the expectations of others alongside decisive reasons how do you differentiate that approach from the more socially oriented voluntarist position?
Mm-hmm. So one important aspect is that my view doesn't appeal to any actual expectations that people have, or any kind of acts that they have performed, like certain kind of voluntary acts. My view only appeals to reasons they have for having those expectations.
Got it.
So that's a crucial difference between a voluntarist and a non-voluntarist.
Perfect. Thank you. So I do think we have time for one more question. Now, there was two, so you can give the microphone to George and let him ask a question. Go ahead. You got to turn it on. It's on. Yeah, you're good.
My name is George. Everybody knows me as a husband of my wife, Marta Bertini. So I don't have any questions. I would like to say, thank you very much for your amazing speeches, lovely speeches, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, George.
Okay, so we have time for, do you have, this gentleman over here was quite, I want to let him ask the question because like the speed and verve with which his hand, you know, crushed the air, I think merits that we hear from him.
Just a short question. Don't you think when we use this term supererogation, that there is something implicit, like masochistic implicit in that? You know? Maybe you just do or you don't do. If you say supererogation, that you like, you hint that there is something masochistic in this, like, or sadistic in this. Like we like, in a hidden way, don't like it anymore, but we want to do this. Like we make some pleasure which goes like against our will, and it's like this like Freudian or like Lacanian jouissance and something like this. Like, don't you think like we just don't have to use this term?
So, of course, we don't have to use the term. That's just a technical term that can be helpful. We can use other terms. The phenomenon is really interesting. It's interesting that apparently we can have very good moral reasons for certain kind of actions while being permitted not to perform them. And that's an interesting phenomenon that philosophers have come to call by that name, but that name isn't important.
Okay, so let's give one final round of applause to our panelists.